Welcome back, everyone. This is Treks to Nowhere. With a few exceptions like the Hard Rock 100, the Spartathlon, or even the Barkley Marathons, I have opted not to share very many stories of my specific ultramarathon races in this season of the podcast. My hope is to dedicate an entire future season to my countless meaningful race reports and experiences. Now, with that said, I did want to share the story of one particularly important 100-mile race buried deep down on my ultramarathon resume. This specific race, known as the Hurt 100, took place in the rainforest jungles of Hawaii back in January of 2015. To understand the significance of this race and why it stands out as one of the most impactful of my many adventures, I will first need to walk you all through the torment and struggle of a doctoral graduate program. Let me explain. Despite what most might think, finishing a doctoral dissertation or PhD program isn't really marked by any one clear or discrete moment, other than, I suppose, the actual commencement ceremony. There are many distinct milestones that are met throughout the process, each marking some completed portion of an arduous yet somewhat nebulous process. We'll call these hurdles along the way. Completing a doctoral program is an absolute test in endurance and stubbornness, which is why the Venn diagram with ultrarunners overlaps so well. It is necessarily a drawn-out process that can feel insurmountable and often without the satisfaction of checking off any boxes or making any noteworthy daily or even weekly progress along the way. There are courses to complete, committee meetings to get through, candidacy and comprehensive exams to pass, lab work and field work to carry out, presentations to make, conferences to attend, chapters to write, format reviews to complete, revisions to make, defenses to pass, and paperwork to turn in, just to name a few of those aforementioned hurdles. Never mind the countless hours of missing sleep, dealing with computer crashes, compiling code, drinking way too much coffee, and dealing with the ever-gnawing imposter syndrome. A graduate student doesn't truly complete a PhD program per se. They survive one. It's because of this that I so often equate doctoral programs to ultramarathons. Often, when students ask me for advice about applying to PhD programs, I'll ask them simply, how much discomfort are you willing to endure? Now, I have always been one that delights in isolating those exact moments that mark important inflection points or the precise instances that an adventure comes to an end or a chapter clearly changes. For example, the moment I touched the final terminus sign on a several-month-long through hike, or the second I stepped up to the South Pole marker at 90 degrees south, or even the instant I touched the infamous yellow gate at the end of my fifth and final loop at the Barkley Marathons. There is something just so tangible and definitive about those precise moments where one condition existed before and a clearly different condition exists after. It's because of this feeling, however, that making it through a PhD program can be so unsatisfying for someone with such tendencies. When exactly does that moment come when you finally finish a doctoral program? It surely isn't after passing your first candidacy exam, but is it after your final defense? Maybe, but even after you pass your dissertation defense, you still have to submit countless revisions and satisfy a slew of other institutional requirements. What about graduation then? Is it the minute that the dean calls your name out loud with the prefix of doctor and they hand you your actual degree on that stage? Maybe, but maybe it's also not until that moment 5 years later, after you've finally published that rough fourth dissertation chapter to a peer-reviewed scientific journal, that it truly feels over. So again I ask, When does that clear and explicit moment come? That moment when you finally feel that the journey has come to an end and you can genuinely move on. There is an important disclaimer to get out in the open here. I originally had no plans on completing a doctoral program. I had been accepted into a master's program and was content on surviving that and then ultimately carrying on in a new career post graduation. I was eager for this program. It seemed like a nice bite sized goal and one that I could complete in about 2 years. It also came immediately following my AT through hike, and I was motivated to start a new life chapter. Fast forward 2.5 years after a very successful master's project, a completed thesis and defense, and an accepted and peer reviewed journal article, it felt over. Not so bad, I thought. But then I started thinking about how I wanted to dig a little deeper. I wasn't content with the jobs I was interviewing for, and the economy was still tanked from the 2008 market crash. I had so many ideas and new questions I was asking regarding my research as well. A few months before graduation, while sitting on a plane headed to a conference with my advisor, I leaned over to him and asked a very simple question. Would it be possible at all for me to stick around and keep working with you as part of a PhD program? My advisor leaned over and told me, yes, of course, you absolutely can, and I have funding for you. Here's what you need to do, but consider this today to be now day one of your doctoral program. So it was in that exact moment, sitting in that small puddle jumper plane waiting to taxi, a plane so old it still had ashtrays in the armrests, that marked the inflection point for when it all began. So, before I dig in and start exploring that exact moment of when my life as a doctoral student ended, let's revisit a few explicit milestones that one must achieve in a doctoral program, just to highlight the level of anxiety and discomfort that must be endured to make it through successfully. Let's start with the candidacy exam. In order to pursue a PhD at Penn State University, where I was enrolled, one must pass a specific type of qualifying exam. This exam, called the candidacy, consists of preparing two short scientific proposals and defending them in front of your committee. This quickly devolves into a session of what I like to call, hey, how about we pummel the student until they curl up in the fetal position in the corner, whimpering and sobbing like a wounded animal. Needless to say, it is a miserable yet ostensibly necessary evil? Question mark. On paper, it's justified as a way to test that a student understands the scientific process and can pose a sound hypothesis. In practice, though, it's a way for your committee, made up of very smart people, to bring you back down to earth rather precipitously and make you feel really stupid and unworthy of a PhD program. On an overcast morning in the fall of 2010, also my very first semester as an official PhD student, I stood in front of my committee and presented my two proposals. One of these proposals I had discussed to some extent with my advisor beforehand, and that would ultimately become part of my actual project. But the other proposal was completely my own idea and meant to highlight my ability to pose a scientific question outside of my direct research goals. Over the next 3 hours, I scribbled half-remembered equations on the board, talked about ice crystal growth in polar glaciers, and tried to pound my proverbial fist on the table that my ideas were sound, defensible, and defendable. At the end, after those 3 hours and utterly exhausted, I was kicked out of the room unceremoniously into the hall, where I sat for 15 minutes wondering if I had passed or failed. Meanwhile, my committee sat in the room debating and deciding my fate. There is a 30% fail rate for this exam at Penn State in my discipline, and if one does fail, they might, and I stress might, be allowed another chance at taking the exam later, but only under certain conditions. In my case, I had already decided, while sitting there on the floor of that hallway, that I wouldn't be taking it again if I failed. If when that door opened, my committee were to utter the words, fail, I would simply quit my PhD program right then and there. An explicit and discreet inflection point for sure. 15 minutes later, the door opened to handshakes. I had passed. It was over, and I felt an immediate urge to vomit. The anxiety had been overwhelming. But just as that weight began to lift and the clouds began to part, I was casually told by one of my committee members as they were leaving the room that I barely passed. It was a squeaker, to use their words. He just had to make sure I knew that as he nonchalantly made his way back to his office. What I learned a few moments later from my advisor, after hearing this side comment, was that my proposals alone would have likely failed me, but my presentation and defense were good enough to put me over, albeit just barely. Nothing like a little hit to the old self esteem and confidence, just as I was starting to feel ever so slightly relieved. I cannot stress enough just how horrible an experience this all was. Even later, with a pass in the books and knowing it was over, it didn't really feel any better. I thought it would, but instead I just dwelled on the thought of how completely stupid I felt and how unworthy I was to be a scientist. During the exam, I also forgot basic things I should have known, like first principle derivations of equations, and now my committee knew just how much I didn't. This all had me fundamentally wondering things like, was I cut out for writing good scientific proposals, or even for pursuing a PhD at all? And just what was it that I was going to do for a career after I graduated? Teach, research, industry? Was this all going to ultimately be worth the abuse and difficulties I was likely going to face for the next few years? All very heavy questions. I ended up spending the next 2 months after my exam working in the deep field in Antarctica, and upon return, I felt refreshed and confident that I could in fact survive the PhD program. However, in the words of my committee, coming to that decision was a bit of a squeaker, and I nearly dropped out of the program. So, with that bit of context, let's move on to the next big exam, the comprehensive exam. The comprehensive exam, or comps as they're often called, is the final big examination that a grad student must pass in order to make it through a PhD program. This exam involves writing up your full dissertation proposal, usually about 20 to 25 pages, and indicating the expected chapter breakdown, your research and work plans, your posted hypotheses, and how you will test those hypotheses. I prepared for my comps for over 2 months straight. 2 months that I could have been working on my actual research, but was instead memorizing equations. I would describe the comps as effectively the second chapter of the scientific humiliation portion of a doctoral program. After completing my 25-page written dissertation proposal, I participated in my 3-hour PhD comprehensive exam. It was much different than candidacy, but unpleasant nonetheless. It was structured as more of an incredibly in depth committee meeting where points of my proposal were picked apart and scrutinized. I didn't feel that I did particularly well, but I also didn't feel as completely embarrassed as I did following my candidacy exam. I spent the 3 hours of my exam presenting my proposed chapters and detailing the finer points, all while trying to answer specific questions concerning the shortcomings and potential issues with said chapters. At the conclusion of my exam, I was again unceremoniously booted from the room to sit in the hall alone, and in the same exact spot I had sat just 2 years earlier during my candidacy, while my committee again decided my fate. 10 very long minutes later, I was thankfully greeted again with handshakes. I had passed for the second time. While I suppose I can understand some of the merits of having these exams, they really do have an enormous emotional impact on students. I had spent weeks studying every fundamental concept of glacier dynamics and climate history that I could, as I just didn't know what I might get asked, and I was terrified of being embarrassed again like I was in my candidacy. It really had me worked up and stressing about preparing for every possible contingency. I mean, how do you prepare for the possibility of anything? I simply had no way of knowing if I studied enough, so I just kept trying to cram in more into my already exhausted brain. I drank way too much coffee, didn't shower for days, and slept maybe a few hours a night. My thesis proposal was fairly decent, but I was again terrified of the questioning portion. When I did ultimately stand in front of my committee, I was completely frazzled, a burnt out shell of my usual self. The whole experience had undertones of a fraternity hazing exercise rather than an academic exam. In the end, I got a bit lucky. My committee asked much more overarching questions regarding my proposed science and not as many detailed equation or fundamental questions, which in some ways annoyed me given how much I had actually studied. By the time I actually received the handshake, I honestly didn't even care anymore. I was effectively an empty shell of myself, stripped to my core, and ready to just surrender. It all certainly does sound like some kind of torture, doesn't it? Following these two grueling exams, a student moves on to the third and final phase of a doctoral program, the ABD phase, or the all but done phase. This period of the program comes after all your exams are completed, but before your dissertation is fully written and defended. It's this phase that is notorious for being the time in a doctoral program when most students quit. There's no more smaller milestones to achieve, just that final defense. And depending on how much is actually written by this point, it could mean that there are still 3 daunting chapters of research that need to be written and defended. I lost an incredible amount of motivation during my ABD phase and struggled to put pen to paper. When it came to analyzing data or preparing samples or writing code or making figures, I was fine and still got very excited. But writing out my chapters was like pulling teeth. It was only after witnessing my partner finish her PhD program a year ahead of me that I finally got that fire to get things written up and defended. So, 2 years later, in August of 2014, I spent 3 hours presenting my research to a room full of family, friends, and peers, followed by a formal closed door defense process. Of all of my exams to date, this was the easiest and really just boiled down to my committee members telling me all of the revisions and additions that I would need to add to my dissertation before they'd eventually sign off on it. So, even though I had just passed my dissertation defense and people were already congratulating me with my new doctor moniker, all I could dwell on was the fact that I wasn't truly done yet, and I still had a mountain of revisions and edits to complete. When was it going to feel like I was finally over? For months, I worked on those edits, pecking away at them until all of my committee members were finally satisfied. Well, all but one. You see, I had one committee member that was specifically interested in my fourth and final dissertation chapter. For most, a fourth chapter marks the body of research that is the least refined and often ultimately not publishable in a peer reviewed journal. But in the eyes of this one committee member of mine, this was the most important chapter and therefore needed to be cleaned up and made publishable. The problem with this was that our data set was partially flawed, and despite the study itself and the methods being robust, it likely wouldn't make it through the peer review process. Our university dissertation requirements only require 3 publishable chapters, so I had met the conditions for graduation. But this committee member still refused to sign my final paperwork for weeks. So, I put my head down and toiled away as best I could, but he continued to ask for more. It wasn't until October when I was finally able to get his signature, only because I happened to catch this stubborn member distracted and he signed the form just to get me out of his office, as he had an important meeting looming. So, despite doing everything in my power and going above and beyond to make this fourth chapter as refined and rigorous as possible, getting that signature still didn't feel earned. This feeling somewhat haunted me, so much so that I did ultimately continue working on that data set for 6 more years after graduating until it finally was published as part of a larger project. I suppose in the end, that committee member got what he wanted, a published paper out of my fourth chapter. After receiving this final signature, I walked back over to my building and tracked down our departmental chair. I remember finding him in the copy room and nonchalantly asking him for his quick signature on my form. With his signature inked on my form, it would mark the final approval to receive my degree and be eligible to graduate. He did scribble his name across the bottom, and just like that, I held in my hands a single piece of paper with 5 inked signatures that marked the culmination of over 7 years of graduate school and immeasurable levels of stress and anxiety. I remember standing in the back stairwell of my building just a few minutes later, staring at this form and weeping like a baby. It's impossible to describe the feeling of that burden being lifted. I ran back to the copy room to make a backup copy of the form for myself and then filed the original in a pristine folder, ready to turn in to the graduate college main office as soon as I could. That would be the last step. But then I got an email from my advisor. He suggested to me that, as excited as I was to turn in this paperwork and check that last proverbial box and graduate, I should instead hold on to the form and wait to turn it in until spring, effectively delaying my graduation until May. By doing this, it would allow me a buffer to get my chapters submitted to scientific journals, but also to interview for jobs. I still didn't have anything officially lined up yet post graduation. Of course, he was absolutely right, and I sincerely appreciated the fact that he was willing to allow me to TA his course in the spring to cover my stipend so that I could have this extra time. But it was really hard not to turn in that final form. I had in my hands the last thing I needed to do to finally feel completed with my program, and I was being advised to instead hold on to it on purpose and continue to wait. It was such a horrible feeling, and all I wanted to do was be on the other side of that line and feel done. But instead, I put the signed form back in its folder, filed it away on the shelf for safekeeping, and it sat there, taunting me for weeks. The semester eventually ended, the holidays passed by, and then spring semester began. On Monday, January 5th, 2015, the university opened its doors. It was a cool but sunny day, and the students were already bustling around campus, scrambling to get settled back into their dorms. That afternoon, I finally pulled that folder off of my shelf after 2 months of being in a holding pattern. At around 3 p.m., I took the short walk from my building on campus up to the graduate college office and handed over my signed paperwork. A few moments later, I flipped open my laptop while still in the office and uploaded the final PDF version of my dissertation to the school's ProQuest submission portal. From that moment on, all that remained was to walk across the stage at commencement. There were no more administrative boxes to check, no more revisions, no more signatures, just a stroll along the stage. Standing in that graduate office to turn in my signature form came with no fanfare. I didn't get any congratulations or handshakes. There was no free pen or coffee mug. There was just a kind young woman at the grad school office front desk telling me, "Thanks for your form. You should be all set now." And just like that, I walked out of the office and out of the building, and 7 years of toil and hard work was simply over. I sat down on a bench, breathing in the cool air. I snapped a few pictures on my phone, and to anyone out there in the world, those pictures will have absolutely no significance and will appear as just random images of a college building or paperwork. But to me, in those exact moments, turning over that signed form and uploading my final dissertation marked a 30-minute window of my life that I will never forget. The precise inflection point, the delimiter of my life in a PhD program and my life after a PhD program. In those moments, I finally felt all of the weight being lifted. There were no tears, no howls or screams, no fist pumps, just a calm feeling of utter contentment. I had slain the impossible dragon. About 30 minutes later, I received an auto generated email from the grad college that simply stated, "Your final documents have been successfully submitted and completed." For the next 2 weeks, I mostly slept. I was in somewhat of a numb state of existence. I went through the motions of daily life, but it was hard to let go and actually celebrate. I kept feeling like there was something I was forgetting, one more thing I needed to do. During this time, I also hadn't been running very much, and I was in desperate need to spend some time in the wilderness. I felt like in the woods, I might finally be able to release the burdens of my doctoral program and move on from this state of existence. Luckily, I had a little something coming up on my calendar where I could do just that. Despite being woefully out of shape, I had a 100-mile trail event at the end of January that would allow me to run through the jungles of Hawaii and once again find my inner peace. And so we finally get to the story of this episode and my running of the Hurt 100 trail race in Hawaii. For this portion of the episode, I will read in large part from my race report. After my late summer defense, I spent most of the fall taking things easy and focusing mostly on my thesis revisions. Needless to say, my overall fitness dropped rather noticeably. Normally, I wouldn't be too concerned about something like this going into an ultra, as I know I can usually just kind of slog it out even if partially out of shape. But the Herd 100 is not the kind of race you can simply slog out. This race is quite arguably one of the most difficult ultras in the United States. The course is notorious for its very low finisher rate, with slow finishing times and quite literally has no flat sections at all. The elevation profile for this event looks eerily similar to an ECG readout, all ups and downs. The temperatures during the race are always high, the humidity guaranteed to be off the charts, and the trail tread is simply brutal. There is no place on this course that a runner can effectively get any sort of rhythm with regards to pace or leg turnover. There are just too many roots, rocks, and obstacles to navigate through. And on top of all of this, the course is comprised of 5 repeated loops, which is always tough mentally to get through. As December creeped up on me, my training was still incredibly lackluster. I rightfully began to panic and thought many times of simply dropping from the race. I decided, though, after much thought, that I didn't want 2015 to start on a low note. Additionally, with my doctoral program finally coming to an end, I wanted some time in the woods for a proper mental reset. So, regardless of outcome, I was going to run the race. As the new year rolled in, I finally started picking up my training. My daily runs began in earnest, and I even started working in twice weekly hill workouts. Still, I knew going in that I was going to be in less than ideal physical condition. I did manage to ultimately eke out just enough training that I felt like I had an honest chance of at least finishing the race, but there was no way I was going to be at all competitive. But that was okay. For me, the hurt would be about finishing under the 36-hour time limit and enjoying my time in the wilderness. I arrived in Hawaii on Thursday evening before the Saturday race, and I settled in. I went for a light 5-mile run and got back in time to enjoy a lovely sunset on the beach. I was staying at a hostel over near Waikiki, and needless to say, the scenery was quite a bit different from what I had just left up in cold and snowy Pennsylvania. On Friday, I spent the day hiking and exploring around the area. I first went up over to Diamond Head and hiked up to the rim. The trails were a bit crowded, but the views were well worth it. While the temperatures weren't terrible, hovering somewhere in the low 80s, it was the ridiculous humidity that I already knew was going to be a problem for me during the race. After Diamond Head, I drove down to another crater in the southeast corner of the island known as the Coco Crater. What makes this one so unique is that there is an old cable car line that goes straight up to the summit. This line is now a day-use trail that rivals Colorado's famous incline. The trail was so steep in places that you have to climb up on all fours. In total, it takes you up just over 1,000 feet in under a half mile. Perhaps not the smartest idea to climb this the day before the Hurt race while also trying to taper, but I simply couldn't resist. I eventually made my way back to Honolulu in time for the Hurt pre-race meeting at 2:30. I grabbed my gear bag and listened to the short info session. After catching up with a few friends who were also running, I headed back to my hostel room for a quiet and restful evening. I still had to get my running gear and drop bags in order for the race as well and didn't want to feel rushed. By 8 p.m., I was all set up and ready to go for race day. I probably should have been panicking a little bit more at this point, but I refused to let the fear of the hurt get to me. There was nothing I could do now but show up at the start line and run. I desperately needed to disconnect for a while. On race morning, I got up early as I was still on East Coast time, and I headed over to the race start at the Nature Center. After some mulling around, all of the runners eventually gathered on the small bridge near the start line. We observed a moment of silence to take in the beauty of Hawaii, and then just a minute later, we were off. The very first 2 miles of the course are immediately uphill, so I found myself power hiking from the start. It was a rather bizarre feeling to already be walking in a 100-mile race, but it was absolutely necessary given the gradients. I put my head down and mentally prepared for what I knew was going to be a very long race, likely close to the 36-hour cutoff. The climb progressed rather quickly, and the trails were initially crowded. But after a few miles, it opened up on a road for a few hundred yards, and from that point on, the trails were no longer busy. The sunrise was simply lovely, and I can recall chatting to the person next to me, talking about just how lucky we were to be running in Hawaii, of all places. Now, this was, of course, all before the humidity really started to kick in. We topped out on the climb and immediately began the descent down to the Pirates Cove aid station. This descent was rapid, and before I knew it, I was out on paved road heading into the station for a quick refuel. After a quick bottle refill and eating some food, I retraced my steps back up the descent that I had just come down and back to the geographic center of the course. The course was laid out in something of a hub and spoke design, meaning that there was a triple junction right in the middle that you return to after each climb. The second portion of the course was definitely my favorite. As you top out on the second leg of the loop, the course takes you along a narrow ridge line with beautiful views off to either side. It's very much like a knife edge, only it's very overgrown and immersed in the jungle foliage. In many ways, it was as though I was running the entire course through a legitimate rainforest. The closest I've come to something even similar was when I hiked down Stewart Island in New Zealand. The drop down to the second aid station at the end of this leg was even quicker than the first descent. Now, despite it only being Loop 1, I could already tell that I was becoming less than thrilled with the repeating nature of the course. The third and final spoke of the loop was the longest. It featured a very drawn-out descent from the top of the course all the way back to the start at the Nature Center. When I did finally make it back, the heat and humidity had already started to climb noticeably. I found myself somewhere right around 50th place in the field, but was already getting tired. I decided that it was time to break out my trekking poles and downshift for a bit. The second loop was one of the more difficult ones of the day, despite it still being so early on in the race. I attribute this attitude to the loop being done mostly in the hottest part of the day. I remember on this loop I kept telling myself to just ease back, take it easy, and stay hydrated. My first loop time had been exactly 5 hours, and I decided to see if I could make my second loop about 6 hours, and then my third maybe 7. Following that schedule, it would leave me 18 hours to complete the last 2 loops, or 9 hours each. This seemed like a very doable pace and allowed me plenty of time to slow down in the later loops. Somewhere near the end of the second loop, it started to really sink in that I was going to be doing this damn loop 3 more times, and I got quite discouraged. I was clearly out of shape for this type of event, and I was losing all desire to be out there. Now, even though it's easy to just say, well, just keep moving, there's plenty of time to finish, that finish is still really far away. The mental aspect of the Hurt 100 is incredible and overwhelming. I think that finishing the Hurt in under the time limit is surprisingly doable. but it's the mental stamina that fails most runners. I kept trying to think about how I had just turned in my final doctoral paperwork and I needed this time in the woods, so I forced myself to press on. And slowly but surely, I ticked away checkpoints on Loop 2 and rolled back into the start at mile 40, right at 11 hours. This meant that I had completed my second loop goal of 6 hours exactly, and I had 7 hours for Loop 3. Of all of the loops in the race, Loop 3 was definitely the hardest. I remember all I kept thinking on the first half of the loop was that I still wasn't even halfway done with the race yet. All I wanted was to be on my fourth loop, because somehow 4 just sounded so much better than 3, and it was only one loop away from 5. It was on loop 3 when I came closest to actually quitting. I remember thinking that I was going to drop at the second aid station right after the halfway point, but then when I got to the station, I literally just forgot to. I was halfway back up the next climb when I realized that I was still running. Oh well, I guess I'll keep going then. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally did roll back into the nature center at mile 60, right at 18 hours. I had finished a brutally slow third loop in 7 hours, right on my self imposed schedule. I sat for a very long time trying to decide if I wanted to go back out. An 18-hour 100K is an exceptionally slow pace, even for the Hurt 100. Physically, I was still doing mostly okay, but I knew finishing the race was going to mean a lot more hiking, and I might very well be out on the course for another 18 hours. In the end, I remembered that my favorite time in an ultramarathon are those wee hours of the night when the air is still and quiet and the stars vibrant. Loop 4 would be entirely in the dark and in those wee hours, so I decided to just go out and try to enjoy it, and also try to remember that this was my first adventure as a newly minted doctor. I chose not to think about a possible Loop 5 or even the race as a whole, simply head out and enjoy 20 miles of hiking in the dark in Hawaii. I left camp right at midnight and began what became my absolute favorite loop. I found a peaceful place within during this loop and spoke to very few people on the course. I never really ran with anyone on this loop and only saw others as I passed them in opposite directions. It was a quiet and reflective time on the course, and I was glad I pushed myself to do the fourth loop. I never really thought about my progress on this loop either. I simply followed the colored ribbons and enjoyed the cooler night air and the sounds of nature. As expected, there was a lot of hiking, but it was fast hiking. I was actually passing a lot of people during the night, and it felt good to be moving well. The field of runners had become noticeably thinner, as many had dropped after 3 loops. I estimated of the 120 starters that there were maybe only 70 or 80 left. About 7 hours later, and just as I was switching off my headlamp, I rolled back into the nature center at mile 80. I was very tired and wanted desperately to nap, but I knew that I needed to just start my final lap, or I might not ever. I drank a full cup of coffee, removed my headlamp, changed my socks and shoes, and reluctantly started hiking out of camp. Every step I took from this point on was the last time that I would have to pass by any sections of the course. The final loop of a multi-loop course like this is always a reflective one. Truthfully, my final loop was rather uneventful. I was exhausted and slow, but muscled out a 7.5 hour final time in the end for the loop. Somehow, I managed to pass 4 people in the last mile of the race, and I crossed the finish line in just over 32 hours and 32 minutes. 30th place overall, smack dab in the middle of the pack. Certainly, a part of me would have liked to have gone sub 30 hours, but considering my training level, I was quite content to have simply finished it all. The Hurt 100 really is one of the toughest races I've ever done, and it definitely lives up to its name and reputation. I have an enormous amount of respect for anyone that decides to tackle this course. Just a few hours after finishing the race, I hopped on a plane and flew over to Hilo on the big island of Hawaii for a couple of days. The next morning, with a very tired mind and sore body, I rented a truck and headed up to the Mauna Kea summit, Hawaii's highest point. Ever since I was a kid and I've had an interest in astronomy, I've wanted to see the observatories, and particularly the Keck telescope, on the Mauna Kea summit. I was a little nervous about going from sea level to almost 14,000 feet in less than an hour, but I figured I'd be okay if I just didn't stay up there too long. Needless to say, once I made it to the summit, I was quite a bit dizzy. When I did eventually return home to my apartment in Pennsylvania, I had a package waiting for me by my front door. When I opened it, I discovered that it was the fully bound hard copy of my dissertation that I had ordered. I had left for Hawaii a few days prior, having only recently turned in my final doctoral paperwork, hoping to rediscover myself deep in the jungles of Oahu. While out on the course, particularly in the dark on my fourth loop, I did find that hard to reach place within, a place that gives me a true sense of peace and fulfillment. So, despite the grueling nature of the course, I was content that I was able to take part in the HURT 100 and come back ready to start an entirely new chapter of my life as an honest to goodness doctor of philosophy in the geosciences. There would be no more exams, no more tests, no more paperwork, and no more doubts. I had survived graduate school and celebrated appropriately. And I had the bound copy to prove it. And that, my friends, is the story of my 2015 running of the HURT 100 Ultramarathon in Hawaii, and how it served as the final celebration marking the successful completion of my doctoral graduate program. Incidentally, for the final 3 months I lived in Pennsylvania, I had a small sticker on the front door of my office that simply read, "The doctor is in." In the next episode, we're going to go back just a few years to the summer of 2022, when I hosted a unique 4-day motorcycle adventure tour in the greater Flagstaff area. This event, known as the NASMAT Rides, brought in several other eager riders from around the state, and, well, didn't quite go entirely as planned, thanks in large part to some unexpected wildfires that popped up in town. Take care, everyone, and be safe out there.